Yeah, definitely. So I think just to frame it really quickly, there's about 114 million people in this country who have a criminal record. 114 million people who've been arrested, which is about a third of the population. When you think about the South, half of people in Louisiana have a criminal record. Half of people in Georgia have a criminal record. Nearly 40% of people in Florida have a criminal record. And so the number of people that that sort of like incarceration, the carceral state effect is absolutely massive. In terms of what we often see happening, when somebody actually goes through the system, increasingly people are coming home on some form of supervision, whether that's probation, parole, community control. They go by many, many different names, but I think the key thing that is common across them is that they typically mandate employment while at the same time making it very, very difficult to maintain quality work. And that is in the form of curfews that prevent people from taking overtime shifts when they need it, which could then result in a loss of a job or a loss of seniority or these sorts of things. Mandatory drug tests that often occur during work hours, probation check-ins that occur during work hours, mandatory drug treatment classes that occur during work hours. So there's all these sorts of requirements that courts impose on people when they're coming home that actually make it very, very, very difficult for people to actually have a job. Um, and what we see is that, there's a few different industries that people are really funneled into. One of them that is the one that we focus on, as you said, Finney, is the temp industry. The temp industry is really broad, right? It spans every single sector, every industry in the economy. But where we focus is the blue collar temp industry, where there really aren't background checks and people are being put into, like I said earlier, construction, manufacturing, warehousing, for the most part. And what we see there is that essentially the way it works is that you have a temp agency that people go to. You typically 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, put their name in the hat to get selected for a job that day and then sent out to that job site. They're typically absolute like the minimal to no background checks. And so people are kind of able to get the same jobs that they, get jobs that they would have been denied for had they applied directly to the warehouse, for example. But the wages are typically about half of what you get paid if you'd gotten the job directly. And there's a lot of confusion that is very intentional around who you go to if you're having wage issues, if you're having conditions or safety issues. So for example, if somebody gets injured on the job, do you go to your temp agency to try to get workers' comp, or do you go to the employer or the warehouse, where that injury actually happened? And there's a lot of obfuscation there about, who is the right person to go to, because both sides are trying to keep their insurance rates low. And so I think sort of this emergence of these Labor Party intermediaries, it's actually really interesting because it's really coincided with the rise of mass incarceration really in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's actually become sort of a key part of the labor market today. And so I think that, that's kind of the way that we think about it. And it really creates these situations where people are in, positions that are sort of permanently unstable. We see people we have some of our members who have been temp workers for 8, 9, 10 years, and have never been directly hired. So constantly doing temp work on a day-to-day basis. And then we see, across the labor market, it creates wage suppression. And then there's also just a lot of fear about actually speaking up about standards or like about conditions on the job, because if you say something, the temp agency could just choose not to reassign you to a new job after your particular placement is over. And so there's just a lot of things that sort of this temp industry, temp agencies really do that affect job quality sort of across the board. And the places, at least in the blue collar temp industry, that we see the most of, it's the same places where we see a heavy concentration of formerly incarcerated workers. So there's really sort of like a very close correlation, I guess you could say, between the way that industry moves and the sort of like really like this group of this workforce that doesn't really have a lot of other options about where to find work.